Okay, this is lecture one, part one. Um, I'll probably explain this in more detail in another video, but let me just, since this is our first lecture, let me just say at this point that this class is a little different from the way I teach most of my classes in that this course is typically taught as sort of a white-collar crime class, which is to study the crimes of businesses. And, a lot of times these are money crimes, financial crimes, crimes also committed by other actors, and some of this will focus on crimes by other organizations, by government organizations, but a lot of the focus is on financial crime. Well, I bring to this issue a real serious concern about different forms of violence. That's really an interest of mine that you see in just about any course that I teach. And so I think that the textbooks tend not to focus enough on elite deviance that involves what I could call, at least in a loose way, violence. So what I'm going to do in this course is I'm going to divide it up into the readings, which as usual tend to focus on white-collar crimes, on these financial crimes. And I'm going to tend to leave it up to you folks to go through those chapters, and I'll give you guides on sort of what to look for in those readings. But I'm not going to focus the lectures on those materials most of the time, because I want to focus lectures which I consider, the material I cover in lectures is what I consider to be the priorities for the course. And so I consider these violent types of elite deviance to be priorities. So in the lectures, I'm going to focus on that material, and this is going to be my own material that generally doesn't come from a textbook. And so you're going to have these lectures there'll be test questions based on these lectures. There'll be test questions that come from the readings, and I'll also throughout the semester have documentaries for you to watch as well on different forms of elite deviance. But these lectures are going to focus on very often on violence-related topics. So it could be confusing, but just think of it like two tracks, that you have kind of a reading track and then you have a lecture track, and we'll be covering most of the time different topics. Hopefully that won't be too confusing. I'll explain more, as I said before, elsewhere. So let's get into this first topic that I wanted to open up the course lectures with, on state repression. Now, what we mean by state repression is that by state we mean governments. And one thing that makes governments unique from other institutions is that many institutions are based on voluntary participation. And so, for example, if you're a religious person and you attend religious services, but then maybe you decide you don't want to do that anymore, or you want to switch to some other church and attend services some other place, that's something that you can freely choose to do. You can choose to participate, to not participate, to switch, to not switch, that sort of thing. It's a voluntary organization. Most organizations are like that. If you get a job at a certain place and you don't like it, you could quit and go work someplace else. Government is unusual because it is an institution which tends to have the authority to use coercion, meaning force, over individuals, citizens and individuals that come underneath its jurisdiction. And the governments usually have this ability, this authority and power to detain you, to question you, to arrest you, to lock you up, incarcerate you, and to even, in some countries and some circumstances, to take your life. So that's a unique power that governments have. And the problem with that is that they can sometimes abuse that power and authority and engage in human rights violations and do things that are really not just and not humane and fair to people. And so governments have a great deal of power that way, a power that can be used for good things, but also can be used to the detriment of people as well. So we want to talk about human right violations by governments, and you can see that there's a focus on force, on violence, on coercion. It's not always violence in the sense of you getting beaten up or killed, but coercion also in the sense of, having your rights violated in various ways. So we're going to talk about that now. So that's what we mean by state repression, is unfair, unjust practices used by governments over people. Now I've got a list here to start us out: genocide, torture, mass arrests, outlawing political organizations, book bannings, so different types of censorship, domestic spying, governments who spying on your private lives, that kind of thing. Again, not all of this violent, but still it's coercion. It's something forced on you that you don't want. These various types of abuses by governments, they've been around since the beginning of governments and the beginning of the nation states. We've had governments of one form or another going back thousands of years. And so that, again, we're just talking about abuse of power, when governments do things that are unfair and unjust to people underneath their power. Let me say, I should back up just one second, because, again, if this is the first thing you're listening to in this course, you may not understand exactly, what fits under this, what's elite deviance, and how does this subject of state repression fit to this course. Well, again, I'm going to tend to use this loose definition of elite deviance, where we're talking about abusive behavior by someone who has power, someone who's coming from a place of a higher position. That's what we mean by elite. And typically in these courses of elite deviance, they tend to focus on business, maybe big government, powerful people in high positions, rich people who have a lot of influence and power, and sometimes abuse that. Again, I find that a little bit narrow, because even though, let's use an example of a police officer. A police officer is thought of as being kind of a working class occupation. It doesn't pay as well as some other jobs. It pays better than others, but it's not like a great paying job. You're not going to get wealthy up being a police officer. So in a course like this, a professor may think, well, if a police officer abuses his or her power, that's not really elite deviance, because that person is has sort of a working class kind of job, so they don't have that high status of a position. So it doesn't. Some people might say, "Oh, that doesn't really fit exactly in elite deviance." I would disagree with that, and I would say that yes, it may be true that officers don't make incredible amounts of money, but they have been given by the government tremendous power, authority, the authority to stop you, to interrogate you, to search your things under certain conditions, the power and authority to use force against you, and even ultimately the power under some circumstances, even legally, to take your life. That's a lot of power. And so in their position of authority as an officer, I would call them elite in that sense. Maybe not in terms of income, maybe not in terms of status, but in terms of the authority that's given to them in that position, the trust that's placed in them to do their job right. That's an elite position, I would say. So because of that, I'm including in this course things that maybe normally are not really emphasized in a course like this, like police abuse of force. So you'll see that kind of thing, and that's why a lot of my lectures go well beyond textbooks, because I take a broader approach, and I'm really very concerned about abuses, these sort of coercion and violence and that kind of thing. That worries me a lot more than financial crimes, even though financial crimes are very serious too. Still, I just bring a little of my own perspective into this class. Okay, so this next point here, let's get back to what we were saying. Sorry for the little sideline there. There's evidence that more people have been killed through state repression than international war. So again, maybe this is not a statement that we're 100% sure about, but what it's saying is that maybe over the long sweep of history that governments have done more harm to their own people, the people under their jurisdiction, than they've done in wars against foreigners, against other societies, other nations, other groups of people. So it's not has not been uncommon throughout history for governments to take abusive actions against their own people. And so it's a serious thing, and it's something we always need to be vigilant of as citizens, that we have governments that are responsive to citizens, that treat citizens humanely and respectfully, decently, and respect their rights as human beings, right? So this is, I think, an important point. State repression refers to the use of coercion against individuals or groups of people within the territorial jurisdiction of the state in order to control threatening behavior. So that's a general statement. To get more specific, if we were to talk about, state repression that could occur in the United States, that would be abusive government actions against the American people, either individuals, you or me as individuals, or groups of people. And so I think it's also an interesting point that point number one is that it's abuse of people who are within your territory, within the United States of America, and that this final phrase here, in order to control threatening behavior. And there's a little bit of theory there, but it's important to understand that a lot of times that's the motivation of governments if they're repressive or abusive of their power over people in their society, is that they're trying to control what they see as threatening behavior. So if you have mobs, if you have riots, if you have what looks to be, revolutionary organization, efforts by people to resist the government or to overthrow the government, that government officials get really worried about that. They don't want to see their government challenged or overthrown or destroyed, and so they're going to tend to clamp down on threatening behavior, and they may clamp down on it in ways that are can be seen as unjust. So that's an important point here, is that a lot of where you see this abuse is motivated by a desire to control threats or perceived threats, and to use force, coercion, violence even, to control the behavior of people. State repression relies on threats, intimidation, physical force. It typically relies on the criminal justice system. See, that's why it's particularly relevant for this course. The criminal justice system is was developed not only to enforce the law and fight crimes and sort of punish criminals, people who violate criminal laws, but also a very important motivation you see if you look at the history of the criminal justice system is that it's a system that tries to maintain order. It's an anti-revolutionary system, and it's an anti-rioting, mob, public disturbance institution. It wants to keep peace and order and to stop any behaviors that would be threatening to the sort of integrity of government, right? So anything that looks like it's really creating disorder and chaos in society, that's something the government might get concerned about, and will use the criminal justice system to try to maintain peace and order. And sometimes you see abuses there. And the front lines of this, sometimes the ones that we see in the media most often, are law enforcement. And you can see that, especially nowadays, that's a controversial area where police officers use their authority to maintain order in ways that disturb people, that people disapprove of the methods that are used. So so this is very relevant. This issue and topic is very relevant for a study of the criminal justice system. Okay, so state repression involves the violation of civil liberties or the rights that you have, like in the United States as Americans under the U.S. Constitution. We have rights that the government is not supposed to infringe upon. You're supposed to have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? You're supposed to be able to live your life freely and not be bothered unless there's justification good justification for the government to intervene and to intrude upon your private life. This government has to have justification for that. So the sort of some of the basic rights that we have as Americans is you have the freedom of association, where you can get together with people, like-minded people, and hang out together and socialize or have meetings, or you talk about and do whatever it is that you want to do. So freedom of association is being able to hang out with people that you want to hang out with. Free speech, we know, we're familiar with that, the ability to voice your opinion about things freely, and for that not to be censored and stifled and stopped. So free speech is embodied and articulated in the First Amendment of the Constitution, which shows the importance of it. Along, First Amendment also free worship of one, practice of one's religious beliefs as well. Assembly, the same kind of thing, be able to group together and discuss things. The freedom to have whatever beliefs that you want to personally have. The freedom to boycott and refuse to, maybe patronize certain businesses or certain organizations that you disagree with something that they're doing. So you're free to choose to not do business with people, to boycott, to picket, to assemble, to protest. That's a right as an American that you have to be able to express your protests against the things that you perceive as injustices, striking from work, to be able to travel freely from one place to another without being stopped, without being detained, from being able to travel around. So these are just some of the freedoms that a lot of times we take for granted, that are indeed rights that are embodied in the U.S. Constitution. Here we're focusing on the United States, and when those rights get violated, then you have something that we could call state repression. So these are some of the areas that we're talking about. Of special importance with this discussion of state repression is the violation of personal integrity rights, meaning sort of you have a right to bodily protection, that you have a right not to be beaten, to be tortured, to be falsely imprisoned without your due process, without going through the legal process of being convicted and sentenced for a crime that carries with it the punishment of imprisonment. So to get snatched away, just this disappearance here, you sometimes see in abusive governments around the world. You'll get, if you're someone who's seen as a dissident, as someone who's against the government, they might come and snatch you away in the middle of the night, and your loved ones will never see you again. Extra legal execution means to be executed by the government in a way. Extra legal means outside of the legal means. So if you're executed, if a mob comes and snatches you and thinks that you've deserve death, and they kill you, beat you in the streets and kill you, that's an execution, but it's extra legal because the laws were not followed in rendering that, coming to that punishment of where you lose your life. So extra legal means it doesn't sound like necessarily a bad term, but it is. It means going outside of the law and executing somebody, and also mass killings, genocide, all those sorts of really terrible, large-scale killings of people. This is really where my focus is with state repression, and a lot of this elite deviance that I really am concerned about is if you have lots of people who are being tortured or killed or imprisoned falsely, that's a problem. That's a serious social problem, and one that we should focus on, in my view. Let's stop right there, and we'll pick up in part 2 on this next PowerPoint slide.